Hello and welcome back to our channel and a happy Easter to you. Today we bring you, as promised, our visit to the North Yorkshire market town of Richmond and its splendid Norman castle. On our way there, however, we passed through the ancient village of Ravensworth and screeched to a halt as we spot a ruined castle we weren't expecting. Ravensworth Castle, the ancestral home of the Fitzhugh family. The remaining architecture is 14th century in origin, and its ruins make for a dramatic tableau against the backdrop of the North Yorkshire countryside. Sadly, after the Fitzhugh line came to an end, so did the castle. It was abandoned and partially dismantled in the 16th century. Making our way in a southeasterly direction, we then head to Richmond, the town at the gateway to the Yorkshire Dales. Richmond is situated on a bend on the River Swale, and indeed our route to and from this quaint little town took us through the dramatic scenery of Swaledale, home of the famed Swaledale sheep and, at one time, a thriving wool industry. Richmond, we've discovered, wasn't always called Richmond, and indeed there is evidence of an Anglo-Saxon settlement here long before the Norman conquest. This settlement was known as Hindralag, and is still referred to as such in the Domesday Book of 1086. So how did Hindralag become Richmond? We referred before to the Norman conquest of 1066, after which Norman King William the Conqueror became King of England. The counties of the north did not readily accept this, however, and it took William and his loyal followers slightly longer to conquer the north of England. One such loyal follower was Alan Rufus, or Alan the Red as he was also known. Alan had already been awarded lands in Norfolk, Suffolk and Cambridgeshire due to his loyal service to King William, who was his father's cousin. Prior to his arrival in England, Alan was Lord of Richmond in Upper Normandy. In 1069, King William managed to oust the remaining Anglo-Saxon lords from Yorkshire with the help of Alan, and as a reward bestowed the lands at Hindralag on him. These lands became known as the Honour of Richmond. From Richmond to Richmond, Alan became, over the next 2 decades, one of the richest and most powerful men in the country. It is believed he began building the castle at Richmond in 1071 as a means of protecting his lands from the dispossessed Anglo-Saxon lords. After Alan's death, in 1093, the honour of Richmond passed to his brother, strangely also called Alan, although an Alan of a different colour. This was Alan the Black. We know little about him, and his possession of the castle seems uneventful. When he died, the castle passed to his younger brother, Stephen. Stephen's son, yet another Alan, became the first Earl of Richmond.
Right, now here we are at the castle's well, which was the only source of water, but for an aristocratic household, I should say, it was important to have a secluded well away from the bustle and the dirt from the town, apparently. Let's go and have a look, shall we?
In the 1150s, Richmond Castle was inherited by Stephen's grandson Conan, who spent a considerable amount of time there overseeing administration and resolving disputes between his officials and tenants. It is likely that during this period he built the castle keep.
Good God. Here I am again. Trying to get through a very narrow space. Let's see how far we can get, shall we?
During the later part of the 12th century, King Henry II took control of Richmond, and substantial building work took place during the 1170s and 1180s. Following this, the castle went in turn to Constance, Henry's widowed daughter-in-law, and then to her third husband, Guy of Thuor, upon her death. In 1204, however, King John took Richmond from Guy after Guy invaded John's lands in Normandy.
Now I managed to find myself in, yes, you've guessed it, another latrine. This time inside the curtain walls. Quite clever, really. Very simple. Just a hole. Drop your breeches straight down there. Quite easy, really. And here we find Scolland's Hall. Apparently this was a place where all of the rich would like to enjoy their feasts, etc., etc. Let's read a little bit from what it says. And it would also demonstrate influence to the villagers, because they'd see all this pomp and ceremony and they'd think, this is marvellous, and we must be on our best behaviour, and so on and so forth. And it says on the plaque, as a multi-purpose gathering place, Scolland's Hall also served as a place of administration, political intrigue and legal proceedings. So it was probably the most important space in the entire castle. That's what it says. So, it did an awful lot.
Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, Richmond was known to be the properties of the Dukes of Brittany, although due to their involvement in international politics, the king frequently seized Richmond from them. By the middle of the 13th century, Richmond was granted to successive royal favourites. One such favourite was Peter of Savoy, to whom was granted 50 oak trees towards work at the castle in 1250. Whilst Henry III was in captivity for several months during the civil war of the 1260s, a prominent figure by the name of Simon de Montfort effectively governed the kingdom, and in 1265 he ordered Sir John de Davie, Sheriff of York, to seize Richmond Castle, which was at the time in the possession of the aforementioned Peter of Savoy. De Montfort was killed, however, at the Battle of Evesham in August of the same year, and Richmond was once again restored to Savoy, but only briefly. In May 1266, King Henry III returned Richmond once again to the Dukes of Brittany, and so the back and forth nature of the possession of Richmond continued, bouncing between the Crown and various dignitaries until 1294, when Edward I of England seized it. He made various repairs and improvements to the castle, including putting a ground floor vault in the keep. He also raised the mural towers and completed work on the domestic range beside Scolland's Hall. At the time, the castle was used to hold hostages of the war, and also, in 1295, to accommodate the wife of Miles de Stapleton, who was travelling to Gascony on king's business. All of this occurred before Edward's invasion of Scotland in 1296. By 1306, one John of Brittany was granted the honour of Richmond after helping King Edward in his campaign against the Scots. It was most likely he who built the town walls enclosing the marketplace after Edward II granted him a toll on all goods brought to the town. His nephew, also John, inherited the castle but died childless in 1341, leaving the castle in a dilapidated condition. Records of the time stated, "At Richmond there is a castle whose land inside the walls is worth nothing, nor the land in the castle ditch, and whose buildings and walls are badly in need of repair." Edward III granted this dilapidated castle to one of his sons, John of Gaunt.
Now, and here we are at the cockpit garden. Apparently it's got quite an interesting history. Between the 11th and 14th centuries, so it says on the plaque, it is likely that the cockpit was a private enclosed garden used by the castle residents. It is overlooked by a balcony from the solar, the main bedroom, or the Gold Hole Tower. Let's try and find that. Guess that must be it.
In 1452, Henry VI's half-brother was made Earl of Richmond then. During the Wars of the Roses it passed to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, future Richard III. It is unknown as to whether he ever resided at the castle. In 1538, Henry VIII had several northern castles surveyed, including Richmond. John, Lord Scrope, and Christopher, Lord Conyers, made their report to the king. Masonry, timber and iron needed for the Port Lodge, the inner gatehouse, the Sware House, the mantle walls and 5 turrets, the great dungeon, 2 wells, the hall, the pantry, buttery, kitchen and tower of draughts, the great chamber and chapel next to it, the chapel in the castle, garth, etc. The circuit of the mantle wall is 2,000 feet. There are no guns or artillery.
Yeah, I think I will. Oh, it just shows. I think they were a lot smaller in those days. Well, actually, that's true. I believe they were. Well, not even that big. Okay, there we go. Well, let's try this way. Okay, let's go this way and see what it is. Get up here. Oh. No, not the dead end. Right, I found the way. Now off we go. Wow. Well, let's take a read from the plaque on here then. Look at what this is. This great room was the centre of power for the honour of Richmond, and a gathering place for most influential people. The rulers of Richmond Castle sat here as they oversaw their vast estate, hearing complaints, settling arguments, and giving gifts of land. Oh, this is basically where they held court. Right, that way I think. Onwards and upwards. Well, I can safely say that that was 100% worth the effort. You can tell that this castle, definitely from where it's situated, had a command of the land. Even those who might have wanted to come up for a little bit of a look and enjoy taking the view, my goodness me, they would not have been disappointed. Check this out.
In 1540, the antiquarian John Leland described the castle as in mere ruin. It remained that way for the next 300 years, ownership changing hands several times, and in 1814 it was described as a striking memorial of worldly instability. Later in the 19th century, however, the castle was put to use once more when the Duke of Richmond, in 1854, leased it to the county of East Riding. The following year it became the headquarters of the North York Militia. The keep was restored and various other repairs undertaken, as well as a new castellated barrack block being built next to the castle gate. In 1908, the castle became the headquarters of the Northumbrian Division of the Territorial Army. Robert Baden-Powell, founder of the Boy Scouts, commanded the division. When at Richmond, he lived in the Tower, the officers' quarters at the south end of the barracks. During World War II, the castle keep was used as an air raid shelter and its roof as a lookout. Of course, ruined castles all have their own spooky and supernatural stories, and Richmond is no different. Two stories in particular stand out though. One connected to the legendary King Arthur and his knights who, myth would have us believe, are buried in tombs within a cave below the castle. The tale is of a man named Potter Thompson, who was walking along the banks of the River Swale one day just below Richmond Castle. As he stopped for a rest, he noticed an opening in the rocks below the castle, and upon peering inside, he discovered a long passageway with a faint, distant light. He stepped inside the opening and crept towards the light, where he found himself in a cavern surrounded by a sleeping king and his knights, dressed in full armour. Potter knew at once that this was the king of legends, Arthur. due to the horn and the sword Excalibur, which was sitting on a nearby table. Of course, Potter was very excited by his discovery and decided to take Excalibur in order to prove his story to everyone. But as he began to remove the sword from its sheath, the knights began to stir, and Potter went running from the cave. As he was fleeing, he heard a sorrowful voice saying,
Potter Thompson, Potter Thompson, if thou hadst either drawn the sword or blown the horn, thou wouldst have been the luckiest man that ever yet was born.
Back in the open air, Potter began to regain his composure and decided to turn back to have another attempt, only to discover that the opening had disappeared. He searched frantically along the rocky banks of the castle, but never located the secret entrance ever again. Another tale is that of a little drummer boy who went missing in a secret tunnel that is said to exist between Richmond Castle and nearby Easby Abbey. Allegedly, the missing boy can still be heard on occasion beating his drum to this very day. That wraps up our visit to Richmond. We hope you've enjoyed it and will join us again for our next historical tour.